I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. As a countercultural person in some ways, I've long identified with the beat movement, like a lot of folks. Go back to the beginnings of the sort of bohemian resistance to modern corporate America and following its threads and inspirations and watching some of its problems and errors. But it's always interesting to figure out what beat people most identify with. You know, which one? Who's your favorite? You know, and I'll put Gary Snyder in the list because he was one of my big influences. And it's interesting. There's different times in my life when I feel like I was a little more in a Ginsberg space, a little bit more in a Kerouac space, definitely in some Snyder spaces. But I must say, as I get older and perhaps a bit more, I don't want to say pessimistic, but critical of a lot of the developments in society, the one who stays with me the most, the one I think that is of deepest value for a full engagement with the totality of reality, not merely forms of exuberance and lifestyle augmentation, is definitely William S. Burroughs. There's something about an encounter with Burroughs. He gets under your skin. He gets into your mind in a marvelous way that allows you to see the world differently, not always so pleasantly. And yet there's a great deal of freedom and a very unusual set of perspectives in him. And the more you study Burroughs, the more he unfolds, the more he opens up, the more he becomes more than the crotchety, gravelly-faced specter that I sort of first tuned into when I was a young man. And there's tons of writings on Burroughs. He created a lot of literature, but one of the most interesting books that I've come across is A.J. Lee's new one, Mentored by a Madman, the William Burroughs Experiment. And Andrew Lees is not just another literary scholar obsessed with the beats, nor is he some kind of madman, a bohemian renegade of the junk circuit. Andrew Lees is a professor of neurology at the National Hospital in London, and he's one of the world's leading experts on Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and other sorts of issues. And his book, you can kind of look at it from two different perspectives. In one way, it's a story of how his encounter with Burroughs as a reader in the 60s really set him on a kind of different tack, even as he became a professor and a neurologist and a researcher and a clinician, climbed his way up the ladder through the various institutions, dealing with bureaucracies, dealing with the conservatism of the medical industry and the sort of role of big pharma and all of these kinds of issues. Burroughs was always there with him, kind of as a sort of counterweight, a kind of a parallel vision of both someone who was very critical of doctors and yet in his own way was a kind of researcher and a doctor himself, and was certainly very interested in medical science in a way that a lot of other people we associate with the beat generation or the counterculture was not. And so in one sense, this wonderful book is a story about this relationship or connection that Lees had with Burroughs, but it's also Lees's own story as a researcher. And you get one of those wonderful kind of nitty-gritty stories, not unlike some things in Oliver Sacks, who was a friend of Lees and someone who clearly was, inspired him as another model of a deeply humanist, critical thinker, also working with the facts of science and the industry of medicine. But he really has his own kind of way of moving through his research, and you get a wonderful view of the kind of mixture of intuition, institutional wrangling, different cultures, different personalities, the way that individuals, teachers, other characters along the way, and especially patients can provide information, suggestion, intuitive leaps that enable the business of medicine to go forward. And so it's a wonderful slice of life. It's not often one gets to see kind of the inside of a doctor's point of view that's not, frankly, another kind of there's a sort of form of arrogance that is often associated with doctors that by no means Elise has anything to do with it. It's a very heartening tale, even if at the end he gets into some criticisms of contemporary medicine that hit home very, very loud and strong in these days. In the United States, wrestling with medical care and the attempts to erode what vague safety nets still exist for those of us lucky enough to have access to them. So it's not the prettiest picture, but we get a good angle of it in Mentored by a Madman. So with no further ado, Andrew, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
It's a pleasure, Erik.
Well, wonderful. I think I would like to start off with when you first read Burroughs, like where you were at in your own kind of career and what that kind of moment was like. How much did you identify with the sort of wildness of London in the 60s, or even if you were in London, I'm not sure where you were at that period, and just kind of how you moved through those that crazy time with Burroughs at your literary side.
Well, I was born in Liverpool, but I first met Burroughs when I was already just starting my medical training in London. And I first met him on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album. And I think, perhaps unlike most people, I wanted to know who all those faces were on the front of the album. And when I first looked at the album, there were very few that I actually recognized. Of course, I recognized Hitler and Marilyn Monroe and Charlie Chaplin and a few other people, but most of them I didn't recognize. But I made an effort to look them all up. And of course, William Burroughs came up under queer junkie writer of Naked Lunch, who had been the subject of the last pornography case in the state of Massachusetts for his book Naked Lunch, which had been banned for 2 or 3 years. And I guess that kind of captured my interest a little bit, but I didn't really take any more notice about it. But I think looking back, the fact that I was obsessive enough to actually identify all those people might have been a harbinger of what was to come, because one of the things you need to be a good neurologist, apart from being a good listener and perhaps in contrast to some other specialities in medicine, also a very good observer and have an acute sense of vision. But you also need to be very obsessive and scrupulous, not only in your recording of data, but in your acquisition of facts. And I suspect that looking back, this kind of obsessiveness of looking at all the names on the front of Sgt. Pepper might have told my teachers something at that point. But I really didn't read Naked Lunch until 2 or 3 years later, when I was well on into my clinical studies in the late 60s. And I got off very well to medicine, although I really started life as a teenager wanting to be an Amazon explorer. I was very interested in botany. I read all the Victorian naturalist books, Richard Spruce, Walter Bates, Wallace, and so on. But my parents, I think, perhaps I didn't appreciate it necessarily at the time, but they tactfully advised me that there wasn't much scope for work in that area, or David Attenborough was already going strong. And they sort of tactfully channeled me towards medicine. So I was I came into medicine through botany. And I think although botany is of no use, or very little use, of course, many plants have medicinal properties. But I think what my interest in botany taught me was the ability to observe detail very carefully and to record accurately what I saw. And those two things were really important in my career as a neurologist. Now, as I went on in clinical medicine, some of the things I saw I didn't particularly like, and I found it quite difficult to continue with my medical studies. For example, young doctors, when I tell this story now, find it quite shocking, and I write about it in the book, that, for example, we were allowed to do vaginal examinations on women who were anesthetized before surgery without their consent. And the patients were often talked about in terms of their diagnosis rather than as human beings. And this I found quite unsettling. Of course, I was a child of the 60s. Even medical students were touched a little by the countercultural movement, although, as you know, and I'm sure it's the same, was the same in the States, the medical students are separated in a sense from the rest of the university and tend to be much more conservative. But what was going on in the 60s did actually permeate through. And I think it was through that I read Naked Lunch. I remembered, of course, seeing Burroughs on Sgt. Pepper, and then I read Naked Lunch. And when I first read it, I didn't really know whether to vomit or laugh. But the character of Benway kind of reminded me a little bit of, and of course, Benway is the antithesis of good doctoring. He's what we all don't want to be. But in a sense, he reminded me a little bit of some of my more unpleasant surgery teachers who were prepared to take enormous risks and even kill people, and really didn't worry too much about doing that. I mean, it wasn't as if they were necessarily saving lives. They didn't really have that much of a conscience, or at least it seemed to me like that as a young man. So I read Burroughs, and I was on the verge really of dropping out of medicine, and I developed this, and of course this is metaphorical, it's not real, but I think I forged a Faustian pact with Burroughs. And Burroughs said to me, "Son, if you listen to what I have to say and you pay attention to my writings, I'll let you continue in medicine." And I did. I kept my pact. And I found what he wrote, of course, he's known for his sorties into science fiction. And in fact, some people consider him to be a science fiction writer. And of course, many of his ideas, looking at them from a scientific perspective, were really quite harebrained. But amongst the harebrained ideas, such as William Reich's orgone and his interest in Scientology, I found much that really helped me to be a good medical researcher. Now, of course, he'd be a terrible model for a doctor. And one of the challenges that we have now in modern medicine is to wear two hats. And it's getting more and more difficult. So to be a good doctor, to care for patients and to treat them ethically and empathically is a totally different process from researching. And I think the best doctors try to do both, and it's really quite difficult because, for example, particularly in North America now, many of the chairmen of big neurological departments in the great universities never get to see patients because they're so busy with administrative and bureaucratic demands, raising money for their departments, advising junior members of staff, that they really have been taken away from patient care. And I think the other driver, which I think Burroughs helped me to stay away from, was this sort of drive, which is in a way driven partly by technological advances, which of course we all welcome in medicine, but to keep the artistic aspects of medicine very much to the fore. And of course this has led to the development of medical humanities courses in most of the big faculties as a kind of reaction to increasing distancing of everyday modern medicine from patient care. So that's kind of how my love affair with William Burroughs began, just before I qualified as a doctor.
Yeah, that's you covered a lot of wonderful things there. One thing that popped up in my mind is just this sort of fundamental question about, you mentioned the sort of humanist side of medicine is really this kind of basic question of whether medicine taken in total is a science or what its relationship with science is. Because, it seems to me a very fraught issue in that it's one of those axioms that kind of underlie your attitude towards medicine, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a patient, whether you're someone trying to understand the way that the industry of medicine is working or the industry of pharmacology. I'm thinking of a recent hullabaloo where the medical school at UC Irvine got some $200 million grant for an integrative medicine program, and I think the wife of the woman had been healed by homeopathy or something, and they took the money, and then they're getting all this grief, and then you have these sort of arch skeptics saying, this has nothing to do with evidence-based medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to ask you necessarily about your opinion about homeopathy or a particular alternative treatments, but it's more that when you listen to them, you're like, oh, for these guys, medicine is science. But a lot of doctors I know, they're like, well, no, medicine is an art that uses science, but it's not a science. And if you think about it as a science strictly, you're kind of missing the boat. And so even though a lot of your story is about, hardcore studies of, molecules, what do molecules do? How do they affect the brain? How can we understand that? Here's some evidence, I mean, it's very evidence-based. And yet there's this other dimension that involves intuition, it involves listening, it involves paying very close attention in a not necessarily like rationalistic way. It involves openness to unconventional ideas. So I'm just kind of curious how you understand from your own experience, the relationship between medicine and science.
No, I completely agree with some of your friends. I mean, I think medicine is an art. I mean, I was brought up in the old school of William Osler, the great Canadian physician, who said that doctors treat disease, but good doctors treat the patient who has the disease. And that's really a very important distinction. And I think although we depend very much on modern science for trying to understand causation of disease, this doesn't always translate into therapeutics and treatment of individuals. And of course, many surgeons call themselves craftsmen. They certainly wouldn't see themselves as scientists. And in my own career, what I've seen is really the doctors who end up most disappointed at the end of their career are those who really set as a target winning the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, because I think what they try to be is scientists, and a few do manage to do it, but really we are not scientists. And when we try and lose ourselves in the wet laboratory, we usually don't do very well. I mean, there are a few doctors who really make a career change. So they decide, well, look, I'm not very good at treating patients. So they get out of that and they go purely into science. So they really become scientists. But I think for the rest of us, it really is an art. The application of holistic approaches is something which I embrace very much. For example, why has it taken? Well, this is not really holistic approach, but I mean, psychopharmacology is really in the doldrums. We've had no new treatments for mental disease, for really new ideas about medical drug treatment for mental disease for 20 or 30 years now. And yet it's only now that people are going back and looking at psychedelic drugs again and their possibility to help people with certain kinds of mental illness, such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And, this has just been there's no good argument. There's no good scientific argument why that moratorium has gone on for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is your opinion of that, kind of ongoing research, and not only in terms of treating these issues like PTSD, which have, of course, a strong physiological dimension as well, but even there's some, as far as I understand it, there's some evidence of neuroregeneration associated with certain psychedelic compounds, and it looks like there's some really interesting things, particularly research coming out of Brazil. I'm curious, since you end the book with a really wonderful story of your own experience. We always have to remember, we got to hand it over to Burroughs. Not just that he went down there as an intrepid madman in 1953 or what it was, and drank this oily brew, and nobody knew what it was. It was totally uncool. It must have been terrifying. What is this going to be? And he has this experience, but we also have to remember, as the story you tell in the book, which most people had not really recall, that he actually contributed his one real dollop of science was to identify that the psychoactivity of ayahuasca was not just based on the copy vine, but that had to do with the infusion of leaves that had another element to it. So it was very insightful work on his part. Anyway, decades and decades after that, you get to have your own experience going down and experiencing ayahuasca. What are your feelings about the possibilities, even particularly with ayahuasca, in terms of its medical applications?
Yeah, well, I think Burroughs does deserve a footnote in the annals of ethnobotany. I mean, it may have been good fortune that he met the father of modern ethnobotany, the late Dick Schultes, while he was in Colombia trying to dig yagé, and he certainly took him under his wing. But he, as you pointed out, he was the first to identify through a voucher specimen, which is now in the Harvard Botanical Museum, the other important component for ayahuasca, which is Psychotria viridis, the leaf that contains DMT. And I think at that time, he'd done anthropology at Columbia after he'd finished his English degree at Harvard. And he was an avid reader of popular science, so he read most modern science. And I think at that stage, and of course when he went into the forest, he just shot his common law wife, June Vollmer, which was pretty awful, and I think he wanted to sort of sort himself out. But I think he also had a genuine desire to be a kind of field worker and a scientist before, of course, the literary world adopted him and he gave up all pretensions of being any kind of scientist. And I've always felt, when I've read his descriptions about his self-experimentation with psychoactive drugs, that he writes in a very objective way about the effects of these drugs. He doesn't glorify them, he doesn't glamorize them, and he doesn't exaggerate, I don't think. So he was, I think, always, even when he became a famous writer, wanting to collaborate with doctors in a way, but none of them would listen to him because he was a queer junkie and he wasn't a member of the establishment. And I think that's one of the things I try to bring out in my book, that there are many ways of making scientific discoveries outside universities. And I think the fact that self-experimentation has become a no-go area for ethics committees and medical journals is a great mistake, because if you look at the history of medicine, it's full of medical mavericks. And when I was training in the 80s, or when I was researching, doing most of my creative research in the 1980s, nothing was considered more ethical than to try a medication you were going to administer to people and patients on yourself first. This was a kind of accepted practice. Now it's almost impossible to do it, and this is a mistake, as you very well know. So, for example, Barry Marshall, who won the Nobel Prize eventually for discovering that Helicobacter pylori caused peptic ulcers. In order to convince the scientific and medical establishment, he had to drink a soup of Helicobacter pylori himself and develop a peptic ulcer before anybody would actually accept that his findings. So this is an argument. So I to go back now to me and my story. So I like many people of my generation, I was offered hallucinogenic drugs in the 60s, particularly LSD, but I was always very frightened to take them. I didn't feel that my brain would be able to cope with them. I was frightened that I might go mad. So I've never taken any psychedelic drugs until this one experience which you mentioned when I was 62. And it was at a time when my research ideas were beginning to run out. I felt I was treading water. I'd become an authority figure. And I was finding that I was beginning to see my career as a bit of a failure because we still really hadn't found a cure for Parkinson's disease. And the magic moment of L-DOPA in the 60s, which had brought me into this particular field, had not been reproduced. So when I looked at other competing fields like cardiology, AIDS medicine, even cancer to a certain degree, the progress we'd made in the field of neurodegenerative disease was a bit disappointing. And I just had the chance, because I was at a meeting with some good friends and Brazilian neurologists who I'd known for many years, in a place called Leticia, which is on the Brazilian-Colombia border. And I had the opportunity to visit a shaman, and I think she was a kind of, if you like, relatively uncontaminated shaman. It seemed to be a kind of genuine ethnic experience as far as I was concerned, rather than a show that involved just paying a load of money out. And I think it helped me a lot. It helped me mainly, I think, to break down certain rigid barriers which I'd built up during my career as a university professor, mixing with a smaller and smaller group of super specialists. And it also made me gave me the confidence to challenge authority much more and imagine different worlds that I'd really not experienced before that. I mean, like many doctors, I was at least doctors working in a social health system like the British one. I was quite frightened of authority. And I'd never really dared to stick my neck out too much until after that experience, when I felt I could speak out much more. So it did have, whether it's a pharmacological effect or just a rich experience happening in the jungle, I really don't know. But I do think it was a positive awakening effect for me. And
I mean, in some respects, it created a space to write this book, which obviously took some guts, because you offer some very frank assessments of not so much specific colleagues, but just the overall system that you're involved in. Some very, very pointed critiques of the current state of social medicine in the UK in particular, and problems with research approaches, but also revealing your own willingness to not sound and think like a conservative doctor, and even throughout your kind of process. So it's a wonderful story to read from people who, like everybody, I've got to deal with doctors, but there's a sort of vibe around them, and they tend to be conservative and hard to talk to. And if you press them, they're not really interested in your opinion. And, there's kind of like this whole world. So it's actually fairly rare that we get to see inside of a career, especially one where you were working with, really extreme cases. I mean, the kinds of suffering that people go through with neurodegenerative diseases and the and the sort of fear around that, but then also the way in which you kind of rise to the occasion, both in terms of not knowing what the answer is, but also in terms of having to work it out with people. So it's great that you had the space to write something that I'm sure earlier in your career you never would have considered.
Yes, yeah. Of course, I wish I'd written it 20 years earlier, but you're right. I mean, I think that experience did give me the confidence to write that book. And as I write at the beginning, I mean, I wasn't too worried about being put in prison, but I've always enjoyed being a doctor. I've enjoyed the fraternity, if you like, of the medical profession and good friendships with colleagues. And I was quite worried when it was published that I would be ostracized and denigrated and regarded as some kind of wacko. And I was actually slightly disappointed that didn't turn out. In fact, many of my colleagues said, "Oh, yeah, of course we agree with everything you say, but it's difficult to change it." It was that kind of thing. And I mean, and of course, Burroughs, one of the things I did learn from Burroughs was the problem of systems, and not just the pharmaceutical industry and the way that works, but the way universities work and healthcare systems work. And I learned through his prescience. I mean, he predicted so much of what's come to pass. So what he predicted has actually come true, or almost all of it has come true. It was probably already there in a lesser degree when he said it, but I think most people didn't really quite realize it. And he taught me really to question everything and be skeptical about. I mean, even I had some great teachers, but I think what I learned from Burroughs was to be a lamp unto myself, and to, even though I can respect and learn from them, I mustn't accept everything that is established fact as being the real truth. And I thank him for that. I mean, I think he did help me with that.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the book is, I mean, having, read Oliver Sacks like so many people, I was familiar with some of the overall terrain of neurology, but I got a different sense from your book, a more specific sense maybe of like the particular and even kind of peculiar role that the neurologist plays, because it overlaps psychological phenomena or things that we would think, okay, you need to see a psychiatrist, or you need to, go to a therapist or something. But so you're on some level, you're dealing with the mystery of the psyche and its pathologies, its obsessions, its neuroses, But it's this very different angle, even from psychopharmacology, as it supports psychiatry. And you also give a wonderful description of the way in which Sherlock Holmes was also important to you as a kind of character, which of course relates to Burroughs. They share certain common features that are actually quite interesting that I hadn't thought about before I read your book. But it was also about the kind of detective-like quality where you're looking at these behaviors and trying to see them as symptoms of something very, very physiological. But it requires you to become quite expansive with your understanding of human experience too. So, I would even just like to hear a little bit more about what makes neurology a unique specialty, and even more like what are the kinds of people who do it well? How are you in some ways representative of a lot of neurologists? Are you more of an unusual character in that particular specialty?
Well, to answer your last bit first, I think I'm a very standard kind of neurologist. I might be a little bit more revolutionary than most of them, but I've worked all my life in an academic center of excellence, doing rounds, teaching students. seeing patients in clinics and so on, doing the sort of standard the business of neurology, whereas Oliver, of course, was a very eccentric neurologist. I mean, he didn't, for most of his career, he wasn't attached to any faculty. He had no research fellows. He was really an individual who visited chronically ill people in residential care that most neurologists had forsaken and left behind. So, and many neurologists, of course, denigrate him because they say he wasn't really a neurologist at all. His writing is more like Freud. His narratives are very long, not always accurate, and so on. I mean, I disagree with that stance about him, and of course, he's attracted more people into neuroscience through his books than certainly any of us as standard neurologists have done. So I think he should be credited for that, as well as his wonderful writing and his humanity for individual patients. But he really is not typical of neurology. And when some of the young people who have read Oliver Sacks and been attracted into neurology through him come to see the real world of neurology, they're very disappointed. You know, when you're faced with a ward full of demented, crippled, handicapped people for which you can do very little about, it can be fairly soul-destroying. And you don't really necessarily get that feeling from Oliver's writing, where he always he almost makes deficits seem like gifts. And of course, that's why his work has been so admired and welcomed by the patient populations, that these people who were ignored and isolated suddenly had a voice through Oliver. And I also admired him very, very much for that too. But I think I've touched on what makes a neurologist, and whereas William Burroughs is perhaps my guiding light for the medical research, Sherlock Holmes was a sort of alter ego for my clinical practice. Perhaps Sherlock Holmes combined with a bit of the humanity of Dr. Watson, so the two rolled into one another. But the diagnostic process that Holmes used in solving his crimes, in other words, using things like careful observation, listening carefully, and particularly deductive and abductive reasoning backwards. These are the essence of the diagnostic process of neurology. Now, neurology has been transformed, of course, by MRI scans and neuroimaging. But the neurology I still find very interesting is the neurology where the neuroimaging is normal. And there's a lot of that. And that includes diseases like, not quite Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's disease, motor ALS, all sorts of very interesting hardcore neurology disorders where imaging has not helped us to diagnose. And that's where narrative is still very important, and I think we are one of the specialities, along with perhaps general practice in the family practitioner and the psychiatrist, who still deal very much in narrative. Many of the other medical specialities have been brought down to algorithms and techniques, and the history is reduced to a sort of vestigial level. So I would say, to sort of try and finish by answering your question, I would say, I was certainly drawn into neurology by its rationality and its systematic examination. And in that sense, it's really quite different from psychiatry. So although we're all dealing with the same thing, the diseases of the brain and the mind, the two disciplines and the way we approach the problems of brain disease have been quite difficult. They do converge, of course, with biological psychiatry and so on. But really, there are still they're still really very different. And if you meet a group of psychiatrists and a group of neurologists, you wouldn't have much difficulty in distinguishing them apart at all. They really are quite different.
I feel we will be amiss if we do not mention one particular sprightly molecule that plays a big role in your story, which is apomorphine, which is, of course, the only treatment that Burroughs took seriously as a potential cure for junk sickness, partly through the ministrations of the very interesting Dr. Dent. And it ends up playing a role in your story as well, as you're thinking about the problems with L-DOPA and some of the issues that happens with Parkinson's and the role that MAOIs play in treating Parkinson's. And I'm just curious again. One of the impressions you get, especially if you read like from the Burroughs side, is you go, look, the guy comes out, he says this stuff's amazing. But it never really happens. It doesn't get picked up. You talk a little bit in the story about how there's, especially in the United States, that pharmaceutical corporations just seemed uninterested in it. What is your sense now? Do you feel that this is still an untapped, or to some degree untapped potential compound? Is the story more nuanced now? Are there still things in apomorphine that we should be looking towards?
Totally ignored. And as I try to mention in the book, I mean, when Burroughs came to London for treatment of his junk sickness, there were a few maverick practitioners scattered throughout Europe who were using apomorphine. Many of them thought it worked as a sort of aversive Pavlovian kind of therapy, so that it made you puke, and vomit after you'd taken it. But Dent, because he'd seen cures in patients who had never vomited on it, came to a conclusion that it had some action on the back brain. It was a stimulator on the back brain. He had no evidence for this, but he felt that it was having metabolic effects on the brain. And I think Burroughs, with his scientific hat on, kind of liked this explanation. It kind of made sense to him compared with all the other failed treatments he'd already had. And it was, it was more than another 10 years before we got to understand that apomorphine actually is a very, very powerful stimulator of dopamine receptors in the brain. It wasn't known when Burroughs was treated. But the crazy paradox was that as the evidence for using apomorphine became stronger from a scientific and hypothetical basis, in the sense that we know that the pleasure and reward systems in the brain are controlled by dopamine, and that many leading authorities in drug dependence see dopamine as the final common pathway for many substance-dependent addictions. The few people who were using it withered away altogether, and methadone arrived, and then buprenorphine arrived. And, Burroughs used to say, treating addiction with methadone was like treating heroin addiction with methadone was like treating alcoholism with whiskey. It was like, it was a totally nonsensical approach. Of course, he ended up on a methadone program, but I think he was a very reluctant methadone taker. And I mention in my book this sort of terrible thing that in California up until 1992, apomorphine was classed totally erroneously as a class 1 substance drug. That means a medicine that has a high proclivity for addiction. And I think, of course, when Burroughs was trying to champion it in Lexington, Kentucky, with the Narcotics Bureau, I mean, this sort of background and the fact that the name sounds very like morphine, although it isn't a narcotic at all, has held the treatment back very much. So I think, I've talked already to you a little bit about the problems of psychopharmacology, which is really in the doldrums, but substance dependence is really in a difficult place because, of course, it's politicized. Those who work in substance dependence find it even harder than the rest of us to launch new trials now because of regulatory red tape. Pharmaceutical companies are very reluctant to splash out money on drugs that have a risk that could kill somebody and they could get terribly bad publicity. So it's really difficult to get these things moving forward. And but I think the hope is coming from, as I'm sure you know, little companies, little venture capital companies, people who have an interested group of young people, scientists who are prepared to take risks and investigate things such as, for example, this idea that medical cannabis might be helpful for Parkinson's disease, that taking little doses, sub-hallucinogenic doses of LSD every day might actually be helpful for people who are depressed. These need to be tested and tried, but it's really hard now to do this.
Well, it seems like one of the paradoxes is, you started out mentioning when you were a student that there was so little emphasis on the patient that you would have something like these unauthorized vaginal examinations, yeah, which are abhorrent to us now. Yes. But we can also see that it was partly the way that institutions attempted to integrate ethics that ended up kind of paradoxically creating the situation that you were very articulate about at the end of the book, in particular, about all of the breaks against research and the sort of incredible bureaucracy and the incredible time it takes to get things going and the huge amount of money and how incredibly conservative it's become. So it's almost it's a weird, kind of logic of institutions where they take in something that needs to be acknowledged and then almost, run with it way too far, or at least can't figure out how to also make space for the risks that are required to make real breakthroughs. So it sounds to me that you do have some hope in that. You see the way that the psychopharmacological industry does have room in it for some kinds of risk takers, and there are these psychedelic compounds, which and cannabis, which clearly are helping some aspects of the problem, and perhaps we can get much more specific about what those things are. Do you see other lights on the horizon, other ways to break up the kind of sclerosis that seems to be affecting so much of the medical industry?
Yeah, I mean, you've made most of the good points. Academic institutions as well as pharma are frightened of their reputation. If you stick your neck out, you usually get kicked out, which is of course what happened to Tim Leary in the 60s, but it's still happening today. So we're all kind of muzzled to a certain degree, and and society of course has become very much more risk averse than it was in the 60s and even the 80s, and often the agenda is driven by lawyers, which may be good, but when you're dealing on a day-to-day basis with patients and you sense and you feel their desperation, you often feel that they're prepared to take far greater risks than our societies allow them to do. And one of the ways forward that I'm hopeful, and again, Burroughs was aware of this. Burroughs used to say, in one of his writings, I think one of his letters, he said he toyed at one time about being an academic, but he said he couldn't bear the thought of spending half his life in meetings drinking cups of tea with people he didn't particularly like and just talking about things without being able to actually do anything. And he advocated, and of course in a way he was an example of this, of the independent researcher, the sort of freelance researcher who freed himself of all these institutions which are supposed to be looking after us, but actually sometimes I think go a bit too far. So one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I think this is a way forward, and many people are, it's not just me, I'm not the only one doing these things, is to work with patient groups. So, often in the context of charities, the Parkinson's foundations and so on. And most of these groups have, and of course Michael J. Fox is a very, very well-known example of all this, but many of these people are very well informed, they know the risks, they know the literature, and they're prepared to experiment outside universities. So I think that if things don't improve, what potentially is going to happen is that doctors will work, as indeed scientists already do. Doctors will work directly with patient groups. They'll get patients to sign consent forms, and they'll free themselves from these terrible roadblocks which are suffocating us, making it almost impossible. Many really bright young people are being driven away from medical research into everyday clinical practice simply because of this problem. And I think it's a terrible mistake, and it's bad for society.
Yeah, we're losing you a little bit there. I'm not sure what happened with your microphone. We just got a couple of minutes here. I'm curious what would you would say to someone about why they should read Burroughs. To me, as I said at the beginning, like he's someone I started reading as a young man, and while I have not read his letters, I haven't gone as deep as I have with other authors. He's stayed with me more than most, and so I'm just kind of curious, like after having this very interestingly personal and even to some degree professional relationship with him as a kind of figure, as a kind of example and a counterexample in some ways. What you would say about his lasting value, today when things are so much darker, they kind of look, we're more in a Burroughs story for better, more or worse. But how would you kind of frame his importance today?
Well, I don't expect that many young colleagues will adopt Burroughs as a sort of unlikely mentor as I've done. But the more general point I wanted to make, and I think I tried to make in the book, was that you can derive enormous benefits in any walk of life that you're in by bringing your interests outside your profession into your work. So by intersecting my interest with Burroughs with my fascination with Parkinson's disease, this has been productive for me. So I could see the same thing happening for somebody who had an interest in astronomy, but they were a neurologist interested in a cure for Parkinson's disease. So it's this sort of concatenation of two separate worlds, which is where often the collisions in our brain circuits happen, which are what the art of the soluble and real research is. So that would be a general point. I mean, as far as people reading Burroughs, of course, many people have considered him a terrible influence and responsible for leading many people down a downward spiral of drug addiction, because they've, particularly in the punk world and the post-punk world of the 80s, he was adopted as a kind of cult figure, Uncle Bill. And I'm sure that people were found dying in a tenement block with a copy of Naked Lunch with them. But if you really read Naked Lunch carefully, I mean, first of all, I think Burroughs, unless I've misread him, I really don't think he ever glorified or recommended drug addiction. But on the other hand, I do think he felt comfortable in the presence of addicts. I think he was disillusioned. I mean, many people, he hated these people who were trying to control us, and he had very good reason for doing that, because, of course, he was a homosexual at a time when it was a criminal offense. He was a junkie when it was illegal and considered a crime rather than a disease. So he really was terrified of people controlling him. And he described this group of people who he called shits, people who were really just there to try and make one's life quite difficult. So I think in a time where we're all being more and more controlled, Burroughs can help us to at least realize that and try to do something about it. I mean,
great.
That's what I would really see him helping with.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for this conversation. It's been very interesting.
Thanks, Erik. Bye-bye.
All right, this A.J. Lees, Mentored by a Madman, the William Burroughs Experiment. Check it out, and until next week, keep your minds open.